Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. And welcome to Birds of a Feather, a new creative non-fiction series where history rises from the ashes of time. Based on historical records, member Narelle Austen takes us on a journey to the unforgiving shores of Newcastle, New South Wales, a penal colony where survival was a daily battle and artistry was a rare spark in the darkness. Our story begins on the sandstone rocks where three convicts, James Hardy Vaux, Richard Brown and Walter Preston, gaze across the restless waters to the dreaded Lime Burners Bay. This was no ordinary prison. It was a place of brutal labour, punishment and occasionally unexpected redemption. Today, we unravel the life of William Harrison Craig, a genteel young artist turned convict. From a privileged English background to the lime kilns of Newcastle and finally to the rugged landscapes of Van Diemen's Land, Craig's journey is one of tragedy, resilience and unexpected heroism. So, sit back, listen closely and let the tide carry you into this haunting chapter of history.
Walt, James and Dick, freed from their various assigned tasks in the afternoon, sat on the sandstone rocks looking across to the knobby little island. It was always choppy here where the river emptied into the mighty Pacific Ocean. This was a restless and dangerous place. But usually the sound of the waves and the late afternoon onshore sea breeze gave them some respite from what was going on behind them. When the breeze did falter, they could smell the stench of kilns from the northern riverbank at Lime Burners Bay. We might imagine their conversation.
Did you hear that poor Bill Craig and some chums from across the river bolted?
Ah, yes. But for the grace of God, there goes I, James Hardy Vaux.
And this wretch, me, Richard Brown. Imagine watching your fingers and hands burn, then your blessed eyes. Him, a portrait painter to the monarchy and all. And they sent him straight to the kilns. What a waste of talent, eh, Walt?
No, Dick, that was his father. He's the portrait painter. His exalted father exhibited at the Royal Academy, I believe. They threw young Bill Craig into Newgate for forgery. But then he was on the damned hulk, retribution at Woolwich like me, and 600 others. Young Bill came out on the Guildford. He got caught again in Sydney for forgery and got 50 lashes for his trouble. Before the blood was dry, they sent him here for 7 years. I ask you, who could last 7 years over there? As you said, James, there but for the grace of God.
The three convicts turned to look across the Hunter River to Lime Burners Bay, where Craig and the others had laboured night and day, under the threat of the lash, to dig out the shells for burning and transport to Sydney. In an excerpt from Settlers and Convicts, or Recollections of 16 Years' Labour in the Australian Backwoods by Alexander Harris, there is the following description of conditions at the Lime Burners camp. There were some dark doings at that Lime Burners gang. One overseer was known to have killed a man with a handspike and was never tried for it. They used to rouse up the poor half-starved skeletons of fellows at midnight to load the lime, when the boats happened to come in with a night's tide. Many of them had scarcely a rag of clothes, and neither bed nor blanket for warmth. How had the convict, young Bill Craig, ended up almost naked on an Antipodean beach, shredding his sunburnt skin by carrying straw baskets of viciously sharp oyster shells to one of several burning kilns further up the slope, while others, up to their waists in the salty water, carried lime powder to a waiting boat anchored in the shallows. The boat would then be rowed by convicts to a ship anchored in the deeper waters of Coal River, Newcastle. William Harrison Craig was his full name. His father, William Marshall Craig, was a famous miniaturist and portrait artist to the British monarchy. There's a telling description of young William Craig in the Bury and Norwich Post in 19th century British Library newspapers. At Craig's trial, an onlooker describes him as
a genteel young man of the name of William Harrison Craig was on charge of defrauding tradesmen of their goods and robbing divers lodgings of plate, linen, etc.
What had led this genteel young man, William Craig, to this? Or had he led himself? Another online historical record of the proceedings of the Old Bailey from September 1810 gives us a rare glimpse of William Craig speaking in his own defence as a self-described tea merchant.
Gentlemen of the jury, it is my humble hope and trust, knowing that I am come before a jury of my countrymen, to offer these few observations. Although they may appear foreign to the charge, yet they are inseparably connected with the groundwork of my conduct. Gentlemen, I am unfortunately deserted and persecuted, and the persons I mean to allude to are the appointed guardians to my wife and family. I was friendless and deserted. My infant son and dying wife made me do acts of the greatest dishonour. Nothing but the most imperious necessity prompted me to act as I have done. I have a letter from the Honourable Mr. Wilberforce, Member of Parliament. I beg leave to forward it to your lordship, that you may be satisfied.
Despite his articulate defence, support by a letter from the Honourable Mr. William Wilberforce, and still suffering from the death of Honora, his wife, he was found guilty and sentenced to 7 years transportation. He was 20 years of age. His privileged background gave him some artistic training, but his respectable family certainly did not help him in any other way. The portrait of William Craig, the convict, as reflected in available records, suggests a young, educated man from a privileged background who suffers a regrettable fate. Earlier events in William Craig's life shed some light on his later criminal career and recalcitrant behaviour. He was shunned, cut off from his family, and left to rot in Newgate prison after committing crimes to feed his young family. His wife, Honora, died. He was separated from his son, banished to the Hulk Retribution, and eventually transported to Australia. William Craig arrived in the penal colony of Sydney in January 1812 on the Guildford transport ship. Records are scarce, though on August 10, 1813, we can ascertain that he received a ticket of leave. Tickets of leave were granted to convicts who had demonstrated themselves to be cooperative and productive. However, later, he was again convicted of forgery and sent to Newcastle on the Estramina, where he was assigned to work in the dreaded lime-burning kilns. This work was atrocious and notoriously short-term. Death was almost guaranteed, and before that painful and ignominious death, the convicts were burned, both outside and in. In London, he was originally an artist who lived by his hands and eyes and sensitive to their condition. Assigned to the kilns, he would have seen any hope of continuing his vocation as being destroyed in a painful process. Meanwhile, other artists such as Richard Brown and Walter Preston were protected, privileged, and living a short distance from him across the river. After 13 months at Newcastle, he and some other convicts absconded. William Craig was to attempt to escape several times, despite the hazards. It appears that the high probability of starvation in the bush, stories of the possibility of maltreatment by some groups of Indigenous people, and evidence that their expert trackers were used to find and return escapees to extreme punishment by the authorities, seemed preferable to remaining at the lime-burning camps at Newcastle. In general, governors and commandants promoted threats that the First Nations people might pose to escapees. They were described as fearsome savages to instill terror in the minds of any would-be absconders. The Aboriginal trackers cooperated because they were rewarded with food, work, and protection. There is one objective description of the results of absconding, even mentioning a convict called Craig. In a letter to his wife from Sydney, John Slater, a Luddite transported for life, wrote about a man by the name of Craig who described his experience as an escapee in the bush, or a bolter, as they were locally known.
When he, Craig, made an effort to extricate himself from the state of bondage, he came to a space where he beheld, leaning against a tree, the skeleton of a man with a musket by his side, also against the tree, which he supposed to be a bushranger, like himself, as they are called who run away into the woods. Many are compelled from hunger to give themselves up, and very frequently so starved that they can scarcely crawl upon their hands and knees to the happy spot of a dungeon.
William Craig was eventually captured after absconding from Limeburners Bay at Newcastle. The Colonial Secretary's papers reveal the next stage of his journey, when he was on the vessel Active for transport to Van Diemen's Land. After disembarking at Hobart Town, 14 convicts were to continue the onward journey to final incarceration in Launceston. However, due to the fear that so many recidivists and escapees would make themselves troublesome on so small a vessel, only 7 were sent on that day. John Jones, James Cannon, Edward Edwards, who later became part of Michael Howe's famous bushranger gang, Patrick Riley, Thomas Chester, Edward Hines, and William Harrison Craig. The story is told that in August 1814, while on the way from Hobart Town to Launceston under guard, Craig and 3 other prisoners were rescued by the infamous Michael Howe and his gang of bushrangers. When he realized that the bushrangers planned revenge on the military escorts, Craig liberated the soldiers and accompanied them back to Hobart. Later, William Craig was recognized by the local colonial authorities for having saved the soldiers from his desperate fellow convicts and bushrangers. William Craig's bravery attracted the patronage and protection of Governor Brisbane in Van Diemen's Land, and consequently he was given resources to continue as a significant landscape artist. Of course, Van Diemen's Land was also a place where authorities were concerned with their image and the need to attract free settlers. For the remainder of his sentence, William Craig, having finally gained a patron, continued as an artist who painted the local landscape for the promotion of the governor and the settlement. In 1816, nearing the end of his sentence, William Craig wrote to Governor Macquarie, offering to present him with his views of Hobart and Launceston, which he probably hoped would therefore be published.
It is my anxious wish, previous to my returning home, to present His Excellency with some small memento of my gratitude for the kind forbearance that has been shown to me at a time when my conduct was marked with illegal steps.
Craig's request, ostensibly motivated by gratitude and possibly the need for recognition and redemption, was denied. Let's return to the early days of the penal settlement. Government authorities believed that those who had been condemned for crimes committed in the growing penal colony of New South Wales had to have a place of punishment which was to be widely regarded as a hellhole of brutality, where convicts would suffer and from which there was little hope of return. The Irish revolt at Castle Hill in Sydney in 1804 exacerbated the need to establish a more secure place in which to incarcerate the remaining troublemakers. Coal River was chosen to be the penal settlement which could provide a strong disincentive to further criminal acts by political prisoners interested in rebellion and those who committed crimes in the colony, the double distilled as they became known. It was isolated from the main colony, accessible only by boat, demanded hard, continuous, dangerous labour, and a place of harsh punishment. Later, arriving passengers could have smelled the stench and seen the smoke of the demonic burning pits on Limeburners Beach across the river from the small settlement. That was where the oyster middens were scavenged and burnt, and the skin and eyes of the convict workers were poisoned and smouldered in their emaciated bodies. The accumulated oyster shells were burnt to produce lime for Governor Macquarie's ambitious construction plans. Firstly, there were the burnt nails, fingers and toes, squints in self-defense against the burning of their eyes, lung damage and lime burners' wheeze, then death. Ironically, the oyster shells were the remains of celebrations by generations of the local people on the beaches at the mouth of the wide river. Naturally, convicts used whatever means they could to avoid the heavy, physical, dangerous labour of coal mining and lime burning, in a desperate bid to survive their years of secondary punishment and labour at Newcastle. An imagined, plausible conversation between three Novocastrian convicts, the literary artist James Hardy-Vaux and the visual artists Richard Brown and Walter Preston, opened this first podcast in our series. We then explored the life of one unlucky convict artist, William Craig, during his time in Newcastle. In the following podcast, we will take a longer look at original historical records and secondary sources to further explore the jailbirds who found patrons and opportunities in one of the harshest penal colonies on earth, at Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia.
We hope you enjoyed this first episode of Birds of a Feather, where we are exploring the imagined stories of those who lived, suffered, and occasionally triumphed in the harshest corners of history. Today, we saw how one man's privileged beginnings led to a convict's life in Australia, a life shaped by tragedy, courage, and the power of art. Next time, we'll dive deeper into the stories of more Newcastle jailbirds, artists, rebels, and survivors who found beauty and opportunity in the penal settlement of Coal River. Be sure to join us again on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.